This is Conversations with Women in Sales, an award-winning podcast created by Barbara Giamanco, who hosted the first 67 episodes. Listen to interviews with amazing women about their journeys in their sales careers, often discussing sales leadership tips, ideas, and strategies. We aim to inspire women to consider a sales career and for some women to grow into sales leadership. Men, we appreciate your allyship. And now, your host, Lori Richardson.
Big shout out to our official sponsor, Reprise, the leading full funnel, product-led growth platform. With Reprise, your sales team creates, presents, and shares product demos, perfectly customized for each step of your sales motion. Go to getreprise.com/womenInSales to try for free today. I'm here today with Roberta Matuson. She is an expert on leadership and communication skills and the author of 6 books. Roberta, I have so many questions for you. Welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. So I guess, first of all, just overall, since we talk a lot about the people on our show, usually there's an interesting story about how they came to where they are. How did you become this expert, and why was leadership so important, and then communications going along with that?
I love this question. I became an expert because at the age of 24 years old, I was promoted into the executive suite. And what happened was my boss had been fired the night before.
Ah.
And her boss, who was the president, called me into his office to tell me. And I did what I thought any other 24-year-old would do. I asked for her job, and he actually gave it to me. So I spent 6 years learning how to be a leader and managing people who were old enough to be my parents and grandparents and making so many mistakes that as I, matured in my career, I vowed to make sure that other people did not make the same mistakes that I did.
Oh, wow. And how did you have that confidence initially? Because we see that I talk about that a lot, where we'll see a male colleague say to their boss, I'd like your job someday. Tell me what I need to do. And most women in a similar role are kind of horrified. Like, I'm just going to put my head down and do my work and hope somebody taps me on the shoulder, which they never do. And how did you gain your confidence?
Well, I'm from New York. Um, and I say that because in New York, we have a little more what we call chutzpah.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it had to do with youth and just thinking to myself, what the heck? What's the worst he could say? Right? No. And when he said yes, I was just like in shock. And that was really the beginning of my, whole entry into leadership and becoming what I call a magnetic leader and, doing everything possible to come up to speed as quickly as possible. But the biggest mistake that I made, which I hope your listeners won't make, is that I was so focused on the tactical piece, like getting all those pieces in place and learning this job, that I failed to manage up. I didn't manage the relationships above me, and I didn't manage the relationships with my peers. And eventually I got taken out by a wave I never saw coming.
Interesting. And so in your latest book, which I'm really enamored with, it's called Can We Talk? 7 Principles for Managing Difficult Conversations at Work. Good job. Congratulations.
Thank
It's really,
you.
really, it's very nice. It's got a lot to it, a lot of great stories, but also a lot of great tips. And as I looked at the chapters, I thought they matched up really well with some of the topics that I talk to women in sales teams about. And since we're talking to women today, I know that you write for both men and women, and I consult with both men and women. But for this podcast, other than our male allies who we appreciate listening as well, I just want to tackle a few of these chapters that you talk about, and there are things that women do really well. And I also say that I'm never trying to tell women that they need to be fixed. But as sales professionals, both men and women can do things to be better, stronger, quicker. And so, from that standpoint, the first principle that you talk about, your seven principles, the first one's confidence. And that's
Right.
got to be the biggest issue that I ever hear about women in sales. Some people just are focused on women need to be more confident. Sometimes there's some debate about is it competence or confidence? What do you think about this? And what's a tip or two that you have from your book?
Well, I think it's a combination of competence and confidence, right? Because the more competent you are, the more confident you become. However, I don't know where it happened. And I see this with my own daughter. And let's face it, I mean, I'm not one to mince words and I feel that like I'm pretty confident, but in many ways she's 21 years old and I see those traits where, that confidence isn't quite there and I don't know why. But with that in mind, I think it's so important to think about relationships, right? Because sales and leadership, they're all about relationships. And so the best way to build your confidence and your competence is to really hone on building strong relationships. And in my book, I talk about, 7 ways you can do this. The 3 ways that I'm just going to give you today are first of all, do what you say you're going to do,
Mm.
because that's so rare.
Yeah.
Lots of people talk about doing things and very few actually do what they say they're going to do, right? So that helps to build a trusting relationship. Be completely honest in your dealings with people, something that many of us don't like to do. And then the third thing is admit when you're wrong. And I see that a lot today, especially on social media, people just hammering their opinions and nobody's saying, wow, that's a really interesting point. I never thought of it that way. Maybe my position isn't correct. So it's really about building relationships. And as you build strong relationships, you're going to feel more confident and you're going to be more willing to push back because you and this person have a good relationship and they trust you when you say, hey, can we talk? I have something important I want to discuss with you.
Oh, those are really great tips. Yeah, especially in a time where there's no middle ground for a lot of conversation. That must
Yeah.
fascinate you. Um, but another principle that you talked about, your second principle for managing difficult conversations at work is about clarity. And clarity is so important in sales in general, because if people go on and on and on and on and can't get to the point, or what I often see at presentations, they go to the last slide to wrap up and in summary, and then they go off on a tangent and go on and on and on and on. And clarity is so important, isn't it?
Well, my guess is you see a lot of people who actually wind up talking their customers out of the sale, right? Because they're not really clear on, okay, what is it that we want to achieve in this conversation? And they get there. And as you mentioned, then they keep talking on and on and on. Whereas that person said, oh, yeah, that sounds really great. And then they don't go for the close, right? And so it's the same thing with these difficult conversations where, you're trying to figure out, well, how can we meet in the middle? What is my objective of having this conversation? And then you get there and you keep going on and on and on. And then you lose that person because you say something and they're like, well, that's not right. So you've got to get really clear before you sit down to have a conversation that might be a little uncomfortable about what is it that I want to achieve, and until you know that, you shouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, your third principle is something it seems like we do in spades as women, and that's compassion. It seems to be one of the traits that we have plenty of, but you may mean it a different way. I'm not quite sure what you meant by compassion in the book.
I mean, being empathetic and you're right. Women in particular seem to be better in empathy. But in the book, I write about a situation where a woman that I happen to know was overly empathetic and gave this guy like 5, 6, 7 chances. And what wound up happening is it came back to reflect on her very poorly because she was trying to be empathetic. And it was interesting because it was a gentleman who had just had a baby and he had a lot of, stress, like many women who have babies.
Yeah.
And my friend, who is, childless by choice, she was so empathetic. She was like, if you need this, if you want to work at home, if you only want to work 2 days. And then the senior leadership, the guy wasn't producing in any way, he wasn't showing up. And they were like, what are you doing? Like, and when it came time to do a reduction, they were like, he has to be on this list. So she came across as not being not a great leader because she wasn't making tough decisions because she was so empathetic.
Well, that doesn't do anyone any favors
Yeah.
because then someone's surprised when, it's time to be
Oh, yeah.
downsized, which shouldn't be the case.
No.
Yeah. Oh boy. Well, the fourth principle that you mentioned is curiosity. And I would think in having difficult conversations or trying to manage a difficult conversation, curiosity seems like such a smart thing because I'm trying to get understanding, right? I'm trying to better understand your point of view.
Yes. Then, some of the areas, when I wrote the book, I wrote it because I wanted a book not just for leaders who had to have difficult conversation with their employees, but for anyone who had to have a difficult conversation with their peer or their boss. And I find like one of the most difficult conversations for people to have with their boss is around performance and money. Well, right. And so if you're, for example, wanting to ask for a raise or a better territory and you get shot down, some people will be like, well, okay. But it's helpful to have more understanding and say, well, can you tell me why you feel that way? What's your evidence? How can we achieve the same results in a different way? Just being curious and asking questions and keeping the conversation going so that you in the end can influence what actually happens rather than giving your power away and saying, okay.
Yeah. And you mentioned that in the book about you give your power away by not speaking up, right? You give your power
Absolutely.
away by accepting someone else's idea, even if you don't agree with it.
Absolutely. And
Instead of
especially
speaking up.
when that idea is about you,
Yeah.
right? Like, Roberta, you're not meeting my expectations. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think there's so much power in trying to get the person that says, it's just like when they say, and this happened for years with women in sales, you just don't seem like executive material, or
Right.
we don't see you in that senior executive role. Really? Why? What if we could just be like kids and go back to 2-year-olds and go, but why? But why? But why?
Exactly. And I see, the whole topic of executive presence. I mean, I have done a LinkedIn learning course on executive presence for women. I did research for that course. I came up with about 25 different definitions of what executive presence is. And I think it's something that nobody really knows what it is, but it's a great line to give somebody, right? Well, we don't really see you as executive material. Well, what does that mean?
Yeah. If I could do anything, it's teaching everyone how to challenge that point because it's so important, and especially now when we're more remote, and it's a very different thing where it used to be, at least in sales executive leadership, that you would be a road warrior, which is typically a man, and they would go to different cities, all week long. They're gone 4 days out of 5. Doesn't have It's not that way anymore. We have remote workers in very, many roles. Many companies are saying we're never going to go back to an office. They're totally 100% remote. And I think this gives an opportunity for women to be leaders and because we've had a real tough time getting more women into the executive leadership roles in sales for, the last 12 or so years. And it's been flat. It's been totally flat. And part of that, I think, is because of expectations, poor communications, and everything that you're talking about here.
Yeah, but I also think it's important for both men and women to think about, we've got this track, right? and we're supposed to start out in sales, and then we're supposed to be a sales manager, and then we're supposed to be a sales VP. And, and so we're on this track. But, if one thing that I think COVID has taught me, it's to really think about these last 2 years. Is that really what I want?
Yeah.
Because you can make a lot of money in sales without a lot of hassle, right?
Yeah.
And leadership is great, but it is not for everyone.
Exactly.
And if it's not for you, that's a tough conversation. How do you tell your boss, thank you, I don't want this promotion?
Yeah. I mean, I was an individual contributor for most of my years and just in leadership toward the end of my corporate career. And I loved it because I was a single parent and I saw management as very much like parenting. And I already did that. So I didn't need to do it in a bigger scale. But for others, I think it's a great option. That's a great thing about sales is that you have a lot of different paths and you can totally go into a different direction like customer care and climb that ladder. You can do all sorts of different things or end up as an entrepreneur like we did.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
but with that sales background, you have the know-how and how to get your business to be successful, which is great. So the next one you talked about, the next principle is compromise. That's principle number 5. And I think women can be really good at compromise because we're kind of the conveners of the world to bring people together. What do you think about that? Do you think that there are just certain skills that we need, whether we're men or women?
Well, I think as a woman, and in my own experience, I think sometimes we compromise a little too much.
Right.
And a lot of times I'll say to my clients, and it might sound like, something you've already heard, but I'm like, is this what a man would do? Like, why are you even thinking this way? And they're like, oh yeah, okay. Right. Because in many situations, it is still a man's world. You're still walking into these meetings and you might be the only woman, or, if you're lucky, there might be another woman there. But, you know, being the one who always compromises and getting that reputation is not a good thing, because it's like, well, she'll agree eventually, right? No, you want to look at it and be strategic in where you're willing to compromise.
Yeah. And you talk about choosing your battles.
Yes.
Yeah. You can't win everything. Can't win.
Like parenting, right?
Right. Yeah. Find the things that are most important. Let them dye their hair purple. It's okay.
Red in my case.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So the next one that you talk about is credibility. And this is one I've heard as recently as just a couple of weeks ago, working with a team of women in a company that there were all women in sales. And they would say things like, people think I'm too young, or how, as a woman, I'm working with older men mostly. How do I gain credibility? I think it ties into confidence personally. But what do you think in terms of gaining credibility? What can we do to practice that?
Well, having been a young leader, I can attest to the fact that I wasn't taken seriously, and I had to do some things that, that it was just part of the job. Some of that comes down to dress, right? You walk into an office and you look like you're going out for the evening, that's a problem. And whether you think you should be judged on how you look is a different story, but it does matter. And so, I mean, I remember this one woman I know who's a consultant who used to talk about all the time how, you know, sh the clients didn't take her seriously. She was so young, but every meeting she walked into, she had like 3-inch heels on, a shorter skirt than most. And it was just sort of like, okay, but what are you projecting? So that's one thing that I think you have to think about. Another thing that you have to think about is, your education. So, for example, in my situation, I knew that I was at the table, the executive table, with people who had MBAs, they had JDs, they had PhDs, and I just had a BS degree. So I went back to school and I got my MBA, and I'll tell you that made a huge difference, because it wasn't just that I was smarter, but I was more confident. And I would be able to talk to my colleagues about, in finance, we were discussing this. What do you think? Right. I could look at the numbers. I wasn't just
Mm.
focused on one area of the company. So I think that, for credibility purposes, whether that be, you need a particular certification in your field or an advanced degree is helpful, that those should all be considered.
Okay, gotcha. And then the last principle for managing difficult conversations at work is a tough one, I think, for some of us is courage, because we don't know when to be courageous. And, again, I'll be told by women, if I speak up about that, they're going to say, oh, there she goes again. Or if I don't speak up, I don't want to be complicit. And it can be difficult to determine when to be courageous.
Well, I look at it a little differently, and I just think to myself, no one is shooting at you.
Yes.
There are parts of the world right now where that's not true, but where we are, at least, in North America and, Europe and other places, no one is shooting at you. And so you have to think to yourself, what is the worst that can happen? And you and I were talking prior to the show about how this particular economy is so fantastic for anybody seeking opportunities
Yeah.
that if you don't get what you need, you can find it somewhere else, honestly, probably overnight, and you'll get paid a lot more money. So if you're lacking that courage, just ask yourself, like, what is the absolute worst thing that can happen? And then just do it.
Yeah, I go by the phrase "go where you're celebrated, not tolerated."
Oh my gosh, I love that.
If you feel like they don't get you, they don't hold you in regard, people take your ideas or they speak over you in conversations, any of those things you don't need to put up with. And there are so many opportunities. People reach out to me almost every day looking for asking me if I know of a woman for certain position, and women are looking as well as men. Everybody's looking right now, I guess. And so there are some real opportunities, and if you want to up your income because perhaps you weren't paid equally, which I wasn't when I was in sales. I was not paid an equal salary to my male counterparts, even though I was a single parent. Very irritating.
Mhm.
But that's the chance to fix that for sure too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this weekend I got a note from somebody thanking me for my counsel and, saying I just accepted a new job and I got 50,000 more than the cap on the
Yeah.
salary. I'm like, you go, you go.
Yeah, yeah. So what did you learn writing this particular book? Was there anything that kind of hit you?
That I may not want to write another one. No. It's like, yeah, that this whole what really hit me is I began writing this book about difficult conversations, but it wasn't until I was done writing it in that I realized I wasn't really writing about that. I was writing about relationships and communication. And that was just sort of a surprise to me when I got to the end. I'm like, well, yeah, this is the book, but it's really about how do you build strong, healthy relationships, both at work and at home.
Yeah. And you mentioned saying something after a difficult conversation, like not just ignoring as a next step, not ignoring the fact that you just had that difficult conversation with someone. And it reminded me of when my husband and I went to dinner one time and the server spilled wine on his shirt by accident. And she couldn't look him in the eye like the rest of the time. And we're just like, really? Can you just address the elephant in the room? Say, really sorry, and just move on. And I've seen that in other situations as well. That if you say, "Gosh, Roberta, that was a really tough conversation we had the other day. Are you okay? Like, is everything? Are we good? Do you suggest that?"
I think that's great because it just shows that you're human, like, and you're acknowledging, wow, that was tough. That was tough for me. It was tough for you. probably tougher for you, but I just want to check in and make sure you're okay. I
Uh,
think that's excellent advice, and I will put that in my next book.
well, and over the years, I do that intuitively, and I think it's just because I'm somewhat intuitive that I can tell when there's a little bit of tension or I haven't talked with someone in a long time. And there's really not much at my age that is going to hurt my feelings. And so if I say to someone, we haven't talked in a while, did I say something or is there something I did or didn't do? And usually people say, no, I've just been busy. We had a sick relative or we had this or that. And and I think we all feel better to clear the air like that. It doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't, it really can't hurt you. No one's going to be like, wow, what can you say about someone that is just curious to make sure all's good between you?
Oh, I think it's excellent advice.
Yeah, oh, that's great. Well, I told you that we're gonna put this on a resource page at shesosummit.com. Um, I'm going to encourage people to read this. It is not just for leadership, this is for everybody. And there's such good stories that you share in here, as well as really good tips, really sound ideas that can help anyone. Can we talk 7 principles for managing difficult conversations at work? Roberta, thank you so much for being on. And we look forward to other things that you're going to be doing in the future. Maybe another book. I don't know.
Well, I don't know. We'll see. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Conversations with Women in Sales. You can find all of our episodes at womensalespros.com/podcast. Help us spread the word and let's change the face of B2B sales.